Hello and welcome to Foolish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining the Persian thinker Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster in the West. As per usual, I'd like to start with some disclaimers. A lot of Zoroaster's or Zarathustra's original thought has been lost to us over the centuries, even one could say the millennia. This is because we're talking about a thinker from a very early period in Iranian history, who would have an amazing deal of influence over a lot of the monotheistic faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, but who, in and of himself, we don't have a lot of works or writings directly attributed to him. This is similar to many writers of his age and in his contemporaries. When you look at the Vedics, who potentially predated him, and writers in China, for instance. Similarly, we have a dearth of direct textual material on the individual. Furthermore, I'm examining Zoroastrianism more broadly across both from the time of early Persian history through to the modern era, where you have Zoroastrians who live in different communities, whether they be in Iran, some still remaining there, the large and relatively well-known Parsi community in India itself, and then the broader Zoroastrian diaspora around the world, and particularly in the West. And it's important to acknowledge that although I will draw out some particular themes in this religion, that it is a living and breathing faith. It is obviously changing and molding as it goes forward, but also there is not necessarily direct linkages and direct similarities between the practices of early Zoroastrianism and early Persia and today. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a lot of diversity within this tradition, which I unfortunately am going to have to collapse right down into a relatively neat and digestible package. So, who is Zarathustra? Well, it's very difficult to say much about the individual himself. He's believed to be born potentially as early as sometime in the middle of the second millennium before current era, so potentially around 1500 BCE, all the way up to potentially living around about the 7th to the 6th century BCE as a contemporary of one of the very first great Persian monarchs, Cyrus the Great. What is key is that the ideas of which his teachings became the kernel within a new religion, being Zoroastrianism, really sort of gained currency in Persian culture around about the 7th to the 6th century BCE. And it's interesting because we know so little about him as an individual, but we believe that he has such an influence through the ideas and thoughts of his religion. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to extrapolate a lot of what he's thinking and a lot of his thoughts are from later Zoroastrianism, because we actually end up losing a lot of the Zoroastrian texts with the Islamic conquests of later Persian kingdoms, but also because of the usual textual degradation that occurs over time. So what I'm going to do now is step away from sort of this iconic idealization of a great man being Zoroaster or Zarathustra himself, and instead examine the Persian Empire more broadly so you can understand the context of the culture which was influenced by Zoroastrianism and how that existed for such a long time and had such an impact upon both the Western and Eastern traditions. The first question I'd like to examine before we move into Persian history itself proper is, where do the Persians themselves come from? Well, although we can't necessarily account for the exact genetic makeup or location of the population entirely, what we can say is that acculturation, invasion, and population of the areas of the world which sort of come into the Persian sphere of influence occurs from the Indo-European peoples. This is the peoples who are linked to the cultures of Europe, Persia, and northern India, who share a common root tongue and in some ways a common language, seen from the common religion, I should say, seen from the similarities between the gods in the Vedic tradition through to the gods in Rome and Greece, and also the gods in the far north, being the Norse mythology and the Norse gods that were followed in those areas. There has been scholarly conjecture that potentially Zoroastrianism actually is born in this matrix of Vedic influence, that prior to Zoroaster sort of coming about with his own conception of the divine and how it interacts with the human, that many of the Persians lived very much a similar life to that of the Aryan peoples who were moving into northern India. There is obviously some very significant differences between the Brahmanic religion and the religion of Zarathustra, and I'll detail them as we get into more further on into this lecture series. But I'd recommend going back and having a look at the lecture I did on the Upanishad and the early Brahmanic religion and its sort of linked philosophy. There are some similarities, but I think there's also some very distinct differences between what emerges in Zoroastrianism and what emerges in northern India. The first of the Persian empires emerges from the periphery of the Mesopotamian world, and I would recommend going back and having a look at the lecture on ancient Mesopotamia to better understand how that society came to arise. So really, Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, was a great location in terms of its writing, its religious theories, its philosophy, its own culture, and the Persians and their associated tribes, so one of which was called the Medes, existed really on the periphery. However, the Assyrian Empire, which was one of the later empires in Mesopotamia, was finally brought to its knees with the revolt of the Kassite Babylonians in what would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire, partially due to the assistance of these outsiders. And originally, the relationship was flipped, so the Medes were the dominant tribe and the Persians were the subordinate tribe. However, what happened is that, if you believe Herodotus, one of the early historians in Greece, through a series of events, Cyrus, who would become known as Cyrus the Great, ended up essentially being born in a situation where the Median king had received a oracle that he would eventually destroy the Medes and bring them under the control of the Persians. Well, numerous events occurred, and eventually Cyrus the Great, took control of the Persian hosts and crushed this sort of nascent Median empire. The Persians themselves actually end up defeating the Neo-Babylonians, and this destruction of the Neo-Babylonians allowed for the return of the Jewish people who'd been essentially conquered by Neo-Babylonians, conquering Judah and conquering Israel for their own purposes, and allowing them to return back home and helping construct the Second Temple. And so this was why you actually have in the biblical references some very glowing reviews for Cyrus the Great. Now, this early Persian Empire was where we first start to see the influence of Zoroastrian faith. And the Zoroastrians are very powerful in the forms of the Magi, who are essentially the priests of the Zoroastrian faith, who administer the fire temples in this early period. And essentially, at this stage, though, it's essentially limited to the Persian upper caste. They and their Medes and the associated peoples practice this faith, which is their faith, but they are ruling over a very multi-ethnic, multi-diverse empire, and as such, they are very willing to let people go their own way and do their own thing. However, expanding power by the Persians sort of puts them into conflict with other peoples. In this sense, they put themselves into conflict with the peoples of Greece, and that's where you have the Greco-Persian Wars, which was romanticized in the 300 movie. However, eventually this triggers a series of conflicts east-west, which culminates with the invasions of Alexander. So Alexander essentially leads a host of Greek and Macedonian warriors, along with a whole bunch of other conscripts, mercenaries, tag-alongs, and essentially creates a massive historical upset. The Macedonians had been relatively peripheral to even the Greek world up until his father's day, when Philip the Great really instituted the Macedonians as a regional power. But then Alexander reshapes world history by going on a series of fantastic and bloody conquests, essentially decapitating the Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Empire, which was the name of the Persian Empire, uh, falls under the control of Alexander very quickly, and he turns a lot of the processes which they'd use to centralize and to administer their empire, such as very efficient, very well built roads, to keep pushing further and further east, eventually conquering entire chunks of what would eventually become part of northern Indian empires later on in history. Uh, However, by the time that he returns back from that far eastern side of his conquest, he actually gets quite ill and dies. And as many of you would know, the empire of Alexander doesn't survive his death. It's split between his many generals, and the one that ends up essentially in charge of the large chunk of the Persian portion of the empire are the Seleucids. This map showing the initial boundaries of where they controlled. Now, the Seleucids end up sort of bartering away the eastern provinces of the Persian Empire for a large number of war elephants from the Mauryan Empire, and essentially sort of see that as themselves done on the east, and they turn their affairs to the west, and they start dealing with the issues of competing with the other Hellenistic kingdoms that have arisen in the wake of Alexander's death, and eventually having to deal with Rome. Now, during this period, the Seleucids were Greeks. They were Macedonians who were Hellenized, so they adopted Greek culture, Greek cultural forms, but also Greek religion. But Zoroastrianism still existed amongst the noble caste of these Persians, who were still sort of filling a lot of the administrative positions within the Seleucid Empire. And this is interesting and important because you never really, although you do have some of that Greek culture flowing through, and it does end up influencing the very next empire, being the Parthians, there's still seen as a distinct separation between Zoroastrianism and Greek religion. And although there is definitely cross-pollination between the two forms of culture and philosophy, Zoroastrianism retains its unique identity. Eventually, the Seleucids were no longer able to withstand the arms of the Roman Empire, and also they had revolts from the Persian subjects that were dwelling under their control. Basically, in revolt against the control of the Macedonians, rose up the Parthians, who were essentially a related peoples to the Persians, and they went forward, drove out the last of the Seleucids, and then established their own empire on the borders of Rome and the kingdoms of northern India. Now, it's interesting because this is one of the few military rivals which really inflicts a stunning defeat on the Romans in the late Republican period. And Crassus takes his troops at the time that Pompey and Julius Caesar are vying for power in the Republic into the east and attempts to conquer the Parthians. And this is where the term a Parthian shot comes from, when someone leaves a room sort of with a sly comment over their shoulder. Because what the Parthians would do is they would charge at full tilt towards the enemy and then wheel their horses around at the last moment and appear to be withdrawing. And as they were running away, the enemy would break ranks, chase after them, and then they would fire arrows backwards off their horse and obviously inflict stunning casualties at close range. Now, the Parthian Empire itself was still a it was still heavily influenced by Greek culture. It was still heavily influenced by the Seleucids and by the number of Greeks who come into these administrative and religious and cultural roles and were living in Persia at the time. So it wasn't really still a sort of Zoroastrian empire. It was an empire of multiple faiths, and still there was simmering resentment from those more orthodox Zoroastrian Persians who were sort of simmering with discontent at the rule of a people who weren't, in their minds, following the true faith of Zarathustra. Eventually, the discontent that I was talking about, along with pressure from the Roman Empire, led to the fall of the Parthians, and in their place rose up the Sasanian, also known as the Neo-Persian Empire. Now, this empire was much more orthodox. This is where we see the collation and, in some cases, the standardization of a lot of Zoroastrian practices, which continue through to this day. This empire was much more powerful, much more organized than the Parthians, end up reclaiming a lot more of the territory which the original Persian Empire held, and as well actually ended up at its height challenging Rome for power in the Mediterranean. Now, at the same time, however, the although the Zoroastrians themselves were a lot less uh, tolerant and forgiving than what their predecessors had to be into other culture and to other religions. Certainly less so than the pagan Romans had been. With the conversion of Rome to Christianity, they actually became sort of a haven where the last of the pagan philosophers and the last of the pagan worshippers would often flee east into the Persian Empire to escape persecution by the Romans. After the split of the Roman Empire and the collapse in the west, and the rise of the Byzantine Empire in the east, we actually still see with the ongoing internecine civil wars sort of waged over religion going on in the Byzantine Empire, that different religious sects of Christianity will cross borders over into the Zoroastrian Empire, into the Sasanian Empire, sort of to seek shelter from persecution. That's what happens with the Nestorians and several other then deemed heretic sects. However, the Sasanians and the Byzantine Empire essentially fought a series of desultory wars, and although this was the height of the Zoroastrian influence and the height of sort of this middle Zoroastrian period, these wars eventually would spell the downfall of the Zoroastrian influence in this area, at least with regards to what it had been previously, as well as the emergence of a major new actor. With both the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires exhausted from constant warfare, it created a gap which was exploited by the armies of the Islamic caliphs coming out of Arabia, who in a stunning 200-year period would not only conquer all of North Africa, but end up conquering all of the former Persian Empire. And this is sort of the eclipse of the Zoroastrian influence with that of the Muslim or Islamic influence. For the first time since the conquest of Alexander, Zoroastrians found themselves in a position where they were no longer masters of their own destiny, and in some ways, from a national and at least in the empire sense of things, this was the last time that Zoroastrianism would have such a profound political influence at the level of states and empires combating one another. From this point forward, Zoroastrianism would now be relegated to a position of subordination and, well, in some cases, a refugee sort of status. Initially, Islam was not very tolerant of Zoroastrianism. Although built into the original teachings of Muhammad, there was provisions for the protection and also for the tolerance of Jews and Christians as fellow members of the Abrahamic faith. Zoroastrians were seen as outside this family. However, eventually, and it is argued by some scholars due to practical necessity, the caliphs eventually granted the status of peoples of the book to Zoroastrians on the understanding that their faith still worshipped the one true God. Now, Zoroastrianism continued to lose influence, continued to lose its sort of position of dominance as more and more people converted to Islam, and the actual size of the Zoroastrian population continued to decrease. And to this day, there are Zoroastrians which live in Iran, but particularly after the Islamic Revolution, which occurred in the 1970s, where the Shah, who had deliberately linked himself with Zoroastrian symbols of the past in an attempt of sort of building up the majesty of his own house, and sort of his attempts at secularizing Iran, led to a lot of Zoroastrians in Iran being persecuted against. Even prior to this, many Zoroastrians who had established trade connections in northern India, as the persecution of Sunni and then eventually Shia Persian rulers drove them out, fled to northern India. And these people ended up calling themselves the Parsis, which is sort of a corruption of Persian in the northern Indian dialects. And these people sort of were some of the strongest cultural identities for Zoroastrian around the world. And many people remember Freddie Mercury, a very famous Parsi American singer who he came from a family, once again, who were living in Tanzania but had originally come from this northern Indian area. However, increasingly Zoroastrianism has become isolated from its original roots in Persia. Increasingly, the numbers of Zoroastrians has dwindled, and particularly because within more orthodox aspects of the community, there is concern that people who intermarry with other faiths, their children are considered Zoroastrian or can't considered Parsi, and also a faith which is not very big on conversion, and even the more modern reformist sides, which have attempted to go on a more particularly in the West, in a sort of a conversion campaign, haven't been very successful. And with the low birth rate, we're seeing a continual decline of this very small Zoroastrian community. So the question now arises, what exactly in terms of Zoroaster's or Zarathustra's philosophy has come down to us? And realistically, we could only, and once again, this is only if we believe in the tradition, take that the core of the Avesta, which is one of the most sacred texts within the Zoroastrian religion, which is called the Gathas, which is a series of hymns which are attributed to Zarathustra. That's pretty much the only aspect of the extant Zoroastrian literature which we accept as potentially coming from this original figure. However, the living and breathing tradition itself has developed an extremely diverse and rich secondary literature, from Avestan in the earliest sense through Old Persian and Middle Persian, with texts being compiled all the way through to now, but some of the more important ones occurring in the 9th and 10th century CE. It's important as well to realize that we only hold a small portion of what once existed. Obviously, with the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire, you had a lot of texts that were lost. When Alexander ended up burning down the Persian capital city, he was claiming this was in revenge for when the Persians had burned down the Acropolis in Athens. We lost a lot of these texts. And then once again, with the Persian conquests and the sackings of capitals and the destruction of libraries, many of these texts have gone by the wayside. However, we do have a nucleus, a core of text, and from it I'm going to try and derive some of the key aspects of the thought, which acts as a backbone both within the worldview, the philosophy, and the theology of Zoroastrianism. So one of the key things that comes out of these religious texts is that there is two main figures. There is a plethora of other figures, and there is some arguments as to whether aspects of polytheism seeps back through. But realistically, the world for the Zoroastrian is divided between two forces: Ahura Mazda, who is the divine, the creator, who represents all that is good and true, and Angramanyu, the lie, the evil, the corrupter, the dark, that thing that represents all that is wrong and evil in the world. And so Ahura Mazda, within this context of the creator, is the generative force. So from within the mind of Ahura Mazda, he creates the entirety of the world. So it's sort of this supposition of the mental over the material. The mental is seen as presupposing the material, which is in itself is built upon the perfect designs that existed within the mind of Ahura Mazda. But it raises an interesting idea, though, because something that ends up to bedevil later monotheists. Ahura Mazda, if he is perfect and he's created this world, where exactly does the position of human free will sit? And for the Zoroastrianism, this concept of free will is woven into every key aspect of their faith and every key aspect of the philosophy of Zarathustra. Realistically, what it's saying is that Ahura Mazda, the truth, and Angramanyu, the lie, they exist together, and it's not like with the Egyptian religions or later Abrahamic religions where bad things happen. There is, like for instance, in Christianity, the devil, or shaitan, if you're talking about Islam, the questioner, if you're talking about some of the earlier Jewish texts, but there's never any sort of real challenge to the Abrahamic God. Whereas Angramanyu has a genuine, actual potential chance of winning. So it's really a dualistic system. And free will is really important in this because humans have a choice. They can choose to be good. They can choose to speak the truth and associate themselves with Ahura Mazda, or they can choose to live the lie and become one with Angramanyu, and they can live out this battle between these two cosmic forces at the very human level, and it creates a great deal of purpose within the individual life. So, what does Ahura Mazda ask that his people should do to live the good life? Well, actually, his religion is, well, very positive. It demands that the people participate in farming. It demands that they live an active life, engaged. It sees, the act of agriculture is central, but also as a very much reflecting his own role as the generative creator, as tending the crop, his people. And so, for this reason, Persian kings and emperors would depict themselves as gardeners, as horticulturalists, and the great pleasure gardens of the Persian Empire were crafted and, well, if not tended by the emperors themselves. They depicted themselves as tending these gardens and then leaving them open for all the people to enjoy. And so it's a really positivistic, engaged philosophy rather than, if you're looking more further to the southeast with some of the philosophy coming out of Jainism, Buddhism, certain aspects of Hindu and Brahmanic traditions, where there's more an aspect of disengagement from the world, a more nihilistic perspective on what life is like. Life is suffering. Don't engage. Reduce your karmic matter. Reduce the likelihood that you'll be forced to go through another cycle of samsara. Furthermore, Zoroastrianism saw the everyday, the elemental, as sacred. Fire, because it is producing light, and because Ahura Mazda is associated with the sun, is seen as a reflection of Ahura Mazda's glory. And the earth, because it is so important in that generative aspect of farming, is seen as another sacred aspect of day-to-day life. So as people live and go throughout their daily experience, even just the basic act of tending the fire, of planting the seed, is seen as sacred and as holy. This leads to one of the Well, for Westerners, one of the more disturbing aspects of Zoroastrianism, and that's the form of sky burial, essentially, which Zoroastrians go through. So, because both fire and earth are sacred within the Zoroastrian faith, what would happen is the bodies of the deceased, because they were seen as polluted, and the decay was seen as a sort of manifestation of Angra Mainyu, they would be taken to these elevated stone towers, what's called towers of silence, and basically they would be left to be exposed, so that animals and the elements would weather away the body in the quickest way possible, and then the bones would be wrapped, yeah, potentially coated and waxed, and then buried. And the idea here was that you couldn't bury the body and allow it to decay because that would be polluting the earth, and then you couldn't burn the body because that would be polluting one of the most potent religious symbols, fire, representing the god Ahura Mazda. And so you now have a tradition of people essentially leaving the bodies of their loved ones out to be feasted upon by the vultures. And this is seen, obviously, from the outside by some people as well, repulsive. But the thing is that when seen within the context of the Zoroastrian system, it makes complete sense. Finally, if asked to summarize what Zoroastrianism means in a single sentence, many a Zoroastrian would probably answer that it boils down to three things: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Zoroastrianism is a religion which argues for an engaged life with based around the fundamental idea of truth and acting to benefit and grow the people around you within your family and the world itself. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Foolish Musings. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, or you can follow me on my blog at foolishmusings.com.